Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me from the great state of Alabama today is my friend Paul Brueske. Paul, how are you today?
Good. Glad to be
Good.
here with you, Chris.
It's a pleasure. Now, Paul and I got to spend some time out on the field together not too long ago. So to kind of be connecting here virtually, it was a real treat to be out on the field with you, I got to say.
All right. It's one of the joys I have of living in the Mobile Bay area along the Gulf Coast is you're surrounded by Civil War era history.
And a lot of people don't realize how rich the Civil War history is down there. I remember the first time I went down there, I was just blown away by how much stuff there was.
So, and I think you saw that there's probably even more than you thought.
Yeah.
There's a lot there, and when we did the Spanish Fort tour, we didn't even scratch the surface of what's still there, and that color bearer weekend with the Battlefield Trust really kind of opened my eye a little bit more to that organization, and where I hope we can preserve some more of that land so that it's conserved for future generations. I think there's a lot there, and a lot of it's, believe it or not, is saved. But as I learned more this weekend, there's a lot more to it to make sure that it's there for forever.
Yeah, right. So lots of nooks and crannies, and you took us to a couple places folks don't really know about, and then there were places we couldn't get the bus to. So let's talk a little bit about that today. We're going to talk about your new book from Savis Beatty, "Digging All Night and Fighting All Day: The Civil War Siege of Spanish Fort and the Mobile Campaign of 1865." And first, just for folks who aren't familiar with this rather overlooked phase of Civil War history, what actually is the Mobile Campaign?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. You know, behind me, you got the Battle of Mobile Bay. You got Admiral Farragut right there on the riggings and damming the torpedoes full steam ahead. And a lot of people, when they think of Mobile, they think of Farragut in the Battle of Mobile Bay. But the Mobile campaign was a separate and distinct operation. The Mobile campaign happened after the battles of Franklin and Nashville and very much at the end of the war, although they didn't know it was the end of the war. Some suspected, but they didn't know. And that always annoys me and amuses me at the same time is people, when they look at history, they work backwards. And so, wow, why defend Mobile? Why attack Mobile? You know, Grant said this, Grant said that, you know, before he died. But um, Mobile was always seen as an important place to defend and to attack, even late in 1865. Now, having said all that, the campaign for Mobile was part of a larger uh, kind of a what would you call it, a two-pronged attack, one from the north and one from the south. Canby's three corps or two corps in a column from the south uh, attacking Mobile, and uh, James Wilson's raid coming out of the Tennessee that reached Selma first. Mobile was never the ultimate objective of the invasion of Alabama. It was seen as an important uh, logistical center that if you're going to garrison and if you're going to besiege or attack, they don't know how long or uh, what forces are in the interior around Selma and Montgomery. They don't really know. They don't know how long it's going to take, and they don't know the war is going to end when it ends. They don't know any of these things. We know that, but they didn't know that. So if you're going to if you're going to get to Selma and Montgomery as they believed and when they were planning this operation in early 1865, you need Mobile as a logistical center to have access to the rail and river systems that lead to Selma and Montgomery. And that was really the real objective was that I call it the Selma Montgomery corridor. I stole that term from what's my guy's name who wrote Bragg is the the most hated general. What his name's escaping me right now. I really enjoy his books, but anyways, um, uh, Mobile was not the ultimate objective. Mobile was seen as a place you needed to capture for multiple reasons, but mainly as a logistical center and as a springboard to launch further expeditions into the interior and capture Selma and Montgomery. And the reason why you capture Selma and Montgomery is for the food stores, the munitions, and supplies that are keeping the Confederate forces in the field. So that's why you attack Mobile. But Mobile itself, uh, after the Battle of Mobile Bay, it had lost its value as a seaport. But make no mistake about it, and this is where a lot of people are, I think, are very wrong. And I just wrote an article for North and South magazine on this. I don't know if it had ever printed or not. I know they were trying to revive the magazine, but and basically I talked about why Mobile was important even in 1865. And even though its value as a blockade running port had been diminished in the Battle of Mobile Bay, it was still an important place from a logistical standpoint with the river and rail access. It was still a river port and a train depot. And it just, both sides thought it was important.
Yeah. And I mean, Grant had been looking at Mobile for a long time. Farragut was thinking that'd be his next objective after New Orleans, but it takes a long time to finally get there because of all the other needs that the armies kind of get
Yeah,
pulled and.
and there's a great book that was written in the 80s by a guy named Arthur Bergeron called Confederate Mobile. And I believe that was for his dissertation for his doctorate by LSU Press. And it just basically, it's an overview of Mobile's, the book is an overview of Civil War era Mobile, lots of different topics. But he gets it right, and one of the things one of his theses is if Grant had been given his way in 1862, when he originally wanted to take Mobile, he thinks the war would have ended sooner. And I tend to believe that as well.
So what's the delay between Farragut capturing the mouth of the bay and then the fall of the city itself? Why doesn't Farragut just sail right up and capture the city? And, I know the answer to this, but a lot of people don't.
Yeah. Well, first off, Mobile Bay is pretty shallow. And the Hartford and the Brooklyn, these big warships and Farragut's fleet, they're not going to get within 15 miles of the city. This is in 1864, 65. There had been no major dredging of the shipping channel to Mobile like you have today. Today you can get big cruise ships. We have the SS United States. It's docking right on Mobile River right now, but we have Carnival Cruise Lines, but you couldn't get big ships there at that time. Not only that, you have a lot of obstructions and everything else. So Farragut, after the battle, let me back up. The Battle of Mobile Bay was a naval operation primarily with naval objectives. Farragut, for all intents and purposes, achieved his naval objectives. At the time of the siege of Fort Morgan, you had about 1,500, give or take, forces under Gordon Granger. Not enough. They didn't believe that was enough to take Mobile. Turns out it probably was because there was nobody in Mobile. They were all defending Atlanta, and there was hardly anybody there. So Granger probably could have taken Mobile right after Fort Morgan was captured, and with little bloodshed. Now holding it would have been a problem, and that's one of the things Farragut said. He said, Mobile. His exact words were, "Mobile's an elephant; it would take a large army to hold it." So he was content to having his forces have control of Mobile Bay, have control of Fort Gaines, Fort Morgan, Fort Powell, and blockade running is over with. So he's fine with just having a menacing presence off the shores of Mobile and Mobile Bay. And, the way he described it was we would have to have a substantial force to hold Mobile, but if we just menace it like we're doing now, they're going to have to garrison it, and that's taking troops that they could be using elsewhere away. So And Canby didn't want to attack Mobile. General Canby was in charge of the Department of East Mississippi, headquartered out of New Orleans. He had taken Nathaniel Banks's place. He didn't want to attack Mobile either. And it's kind of funny. General Gordon Granger, during the siege of Fort Morgan, he was petitioning both Canby and Farragut to move against Mobile. He thought he could land a force near Dog River, and with some, these shallow draft gunboat monitors, he felt like with a demonstration by them on the shore batteries, he could take Mobile, and he was probably right. But Canby was very cautious, and he concurred with Farragut. He said, we don't really need Mobile. We've sealed the port there. We don't have enough troops to hold it. It's better to let the Confederates have to deal with it, and it frees up our troops for other operations. And that there was other things still going on. You had Atlanta, you had Sherman's March was still going on. You had Nashville and Franklin, and just a lot of things were interfering. It wasn't until after the Battle of Nashville that Henry Halleck, who had turned down Grant's propositions earlier in the war to move against Mobile, he's the one who actually suggested to Grant, said, "Hey, we should move against Mobile," and he suggested the campaign against Mobile to Grant. Of course, Grant didn't need much convincing. He had wanted to move against Mobile for a long time.
So when that operation does finally get underway, though, he's got people that are kind of in charge of that operation that he doesn't like a whole lot or doesn't have a whole lot of confidence in. Canby, he's got kind of an odd relationship with Canby. He doesn't think Canby is necessarily aggressive enough.
He,
Not
he
a
doesn't
fan of
think
Gordon
Canby
Granger.
moves enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And not a fan of Gordon Granger either.
Hates Gordon Granger's guts. There was a book written about Gordon Granger by one of his descendants, and I enjoyed it a lot. It's a really good book. I think it's either by Casemate or maybe Savas Beatty, and he kind of traces where that came from, and it goes back to Tennessee. And before we had cell phones, appears that Gordon Granger was drinking a little too much. He didn't care for Sherman. He didn't care for Grant too much. And Granger was kind of an independent spirit. And, as you saw he disobeyed orders to basically save George Thomas's tail at Chickamauga, but he's a hard fighter, and he's a stubborn guy, apparently. And he sent a telegraph to Grant that was derogatory in nature, and apparently been drinking. So Grant didn't like that too much, and soon after, I think Granger had gotten a little bit sick, and Sherman used that as an opportunity to replace him.
It's that drunk text you send to your ex-girlfriend that the next day you wish you hadn't, right?
Right. And one of the things, if you look at Grant's memoirs, and if you look at some of the official record dispatches from Grant, he did not like Granger, and he went out of his way to try to derail his career, even after the Civil War. Grant had a vindictive streak to him, it seemed to me, and he really disliked Granger. He sent a dispatch to Canby. He said, he went through Halleck on this. He said, you're not to give Granger a large command because it's sure to fail. Well, Canby had dealt with Granger, and Granger did a heck of a job at a lot of places, but he did a heck of a job in the siege of Fort Morgan and the expedition against Dauphin Island's Fort Gaines. So Canby had a lot of confidence based on his experiences with him. So he had no reservation about using Granger. He thought that Canby's comments were more of a suggestion. I'm sorry, not Canby thought Granger's comments. No, sorry. Canby thought Grant's comments about Granger were a suggestion, and so that's why he did what he did. So he gave Granger the 13th Army Corps.
And what's your assessment
And
of,
Grant was pissed about that.
yeah, what's your assessment of Canby?
I think that from what I gather with him, he was very cautious, maybe overly cautious. But I think at the end of the day, most of his troops, they're kind of like, what's the deal with this guy? Every time we stop, we have to throw up breastworks and protective fortifications on his march. He's very cautious. So I think that was kind of like, what's the deal with this guy? But he had never led a large expedition himself. This was his first major operation. Of the war. He'd been most of his career had been a staff officer in Washington, and other than some early campaigning in the Glorita Pass early in the war in New Mexico, he had not seen a lot of active duty. Mostly he'd been working as an administrative office general in Washington, a staff officer in Washington. But he was very organized, very meticulous, and very, very cautious. But I think from some of the accounts that I read after the war, some of the dispatches, I think a lot of the guys appreciated his cautiousness because, in my estimation, he saved a lot of lives.
So when is it that they, oh, well, let's talk about the Confederate side for a second before we actually get into kind of the movements here. So there's been sort of, Mobile's kind of the backwater a little bit because it's not on the front line. So what sort of forces are occupying Mobile at this point, and who's in charge of them?
Well, Dabney Herndon Maury, Matthew Fontaine Maury of the naval fame, that's his nephew, and Maury was come from a prominent Virginian family, and he'd been in the Western Theater throughout the war. But he's in charge of the District of the Gulf, headquartered at Mobile. He didn't
In
have a
fact,
whole lot.
just a little bit of trivia. Maury's buried right here in Fredericksburg, where I'm at, because that's where
Yes.
his family's from. Yeah.
Yeah, he died in Illinois, though. I guess his son was living up. One of the things I find curious. A lot of these Southerners moved north after the war, and then Simon. I was just reading a letter from the Victor von Sheila, who was in charge of the defenses of Mobile, the chief engineer, and he had at one point earlier served as Buckner's chief of staff, and I guess I should have known this, but Buckner was governor of Kentucky, which was I guess they switched over to the Confederacy after the war, but he was governor of technically a Union state. I thought that was pretty interesting. But no, there wasn't much there. You had 22nd Louisiana, the 21st Alabama. You had some militia and home guard. You had some Creole units. You had mostly home guard units, but with the fall or after the fiasco at Nashville, they sent in reinforcements because they anticipated the attack of Mobile. And so what they did was Richard Taylor took temporary command after Nashville took John Bell Hood's place. So the Army of Tennessee is regrouping near Verona, Mississippi, near Tupelo. And basically Richard Taylor apprehends an attack on Mobile, so he knows he needs to send some forces there. And so he's evaluating the men. And what he finds is French's division is in bad shape. I mean, they had taken heavy casualties throughout the campaign of Atlanta. These guys had been everywhere. They'd fought, in Vicksburg and Atlanta and Nashville and Frank and all, just in really rough shape. Everybody was wounded, it seemed like. So anyways, he said, these guys are in bad shape. Doesn't think they're fit for, heavy marching and campaigning in the open field. So he says, you know what, they can't do that, but if they're in Mobile, they're going to be behind heavy fortifications. And he said, you know what, they can do that. So that was part of the reason he chose to send French's division to Mobile is they were so beat up and in bad shape that he didn't think that they would do well in North Carolina, where they're actively moving. and marching. He sends Gibson's brigade, Randall E. Gibson, Louisiana. Those guys also had sustained heavy casualties. So much or most of the regiments of Gibson's brigade have been consolidated at this point, and not a lot of numbers. But basically, he sent 5 brigades, and interestingly enough, they sent most of the artillery of the Army of Tennessee was sent to Mobile, and a few batteries were left up at Meridian, but most were sent down to Mobile. So most of the and then the 25, there was, I think it was 25 brigades go to North Carolina, and they reinstate Johnston. So that's what they sent to Mobile.
So,
in all, not more than 9,000 troops.
yeah. And how fortified is Mobile at this point?
Okay. The western approaches, they had always anticipated an attack coming from Pascagoula. So the western approaches, there were 3 huge lines of earthen fortifications that defended the western approaches to Mobile. Massive. And I can actually take you to 1 or 2 places that look like hills in Mobile. They're not hills. They're part of those 3 lines. There's not much of it left, but most of it got bulldozed. The last of it pretty much got bulldozed in the 60s. But these are enormously strong fortifications defending the western approaches. And when the Federals' 13th Army Corps marched into Mobile on April 12th, they all marveled at how strong the fortifications were there. It was just unbelievable on the western side. Okay. Spanish Fort and Fort Blakely weren't built until they didn't start working on that until basically the end of the siege of Fort Morgan in August 1864. So they only had about 8 months to prepare those. So they were incomplete and not nearly as strong as the western approaches. And, you know, there was always the idea that they shouldn't fortify the eastern shore, but I think they kind of panicked a little bit and said, we need to fortify over there. But the problem is they didn't have enough men to adequately fortify those positions. They would have been better off, in, you know, hindsight's 2020. I'm being they would have been better off strengthening these marsh batteries that they had already constructed earlier, and just making those stronger and self-supporting. If they would have concentrated their efforts on there, they probably could have held out even longer.
And I suppose it's worth mentioning that, you know, Mobile Bay is 30 miles from tip to tip. And then at the northern end is this incredibly huge and intricate delta system. And so these marshes that you're talking about, intertwined rivers, and Mobile sits up in that northern end on the western side of the bay, and Spanish Fort's on the eastern side of the bay.
And Mobile was, you know, if you go back to the original, you know, French colonials, they decided to put Mobile where it was for military reasons, because it was tucked away. You know, you have the shallow bay coming in, you had the Dog River to the south, you have a marshy swamp to the north of the city, and you know, you tuck Mobile in there, you're not going to be able to do what Farragut did to New Orleans. That's not going to happen in Mobile. There's no way it's going to happen. And as we'll see later in the Mobile campaign, Victor von Schiehla's defenses, although they failed during the Battle of Mobile Bay, they did not fail in the campaign of Mobile when it comes to stopping the Navy. They stopped the Navy in its track. And one of the things I'm kind of researching now is this Victor von Schiele, a Prussian trained. He lived in Germany, came over in 1851, went to the war colleges in Prussia, and highly educated engineer. And right after the Civil War, he wrote a book called The Treatise on Coastal Defense that he presented to the Prussian prince. And he was given a recommission in the Prussian army after the Civil War, and was an authority on coastal defense. And he was on von Moltke's staff during the Franco-Prussian War, and he was a highly valued guy, but his experience was the successes and failures of Mobile Bay. So in that sense, Mobile Bay, if you're looking at the evolution of warfare, mines, submarines, torpedoes, um, von Schiehlaha got his start in coastal defense in Mobile. And he took that experience, and after the Franco-Prussian War, von Moltke's introduced him to Todleben, the famous Russian general. And Todleben had, I hope I'm not pronouncing it correctly, invited von Schiehlaha to Russia, where he stayed for the next decade, and apparently served in the Russo-Turkish War for the Russian government. So this guy, from his experiences in Mobile, took that throughout his career, and he was even in the 1890s, at the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, he was living with his daughter in Seattle. Sorry, I'm getting on a tangent. I just think this is what I'm into right now.
Yeah.
They consulted with him on fortifying and defending the Puget Sound in Seattle. Based on he was, in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, they quoted him many times, and they referred to him. They had a committee on coastal defense because they were really worried that the Spanish were going to somehow attack Seattle. So they consulted with von Schiehlaha, who was, in his 70s and living with his daughter there. But very fascinating character, and I think a lot of people don't know anything about him. But I'm really doing some digging on him, and I think it's an interesting transnational figure who'd been to Prussia, came to America. He wasn't an 1848er. He fought against the radicals, the German radicals in 1848. He was a conservative and came over to America, and then he sided with the Confederates, which most of the German, there were some of the German nobility tended to side with the Confederates, and he was on that side of things. But anyways, I'm sorry, I got off on a tangent.
Fascinating guy, though. We were talking about him a lot when we were out on the tour.
Yeah, and the more I find about the guy, it's just unbelievable. I don't know if it's book worthy, but maybe I put together an article.
So with the intensive fortifications around the city itself, Canby decides he's going to come up the eastern side of the bay instead of the western side of the bay, knowing that he's still going to have Spanish Fort, he's going to have Fort Blakely, and then he's going to have to cross either the bay or the marshes. Why does that still look like it's the better option?
Well, it's the path of least resistance. Those fortifications I told you about on the western shore, there was no real fighting there, and there was a reason, because it was so strong. I mean, you got to remember, even though Mobile has experienced all types of labor shortages during the war, they had 4 years to put up not one, not two, but 3 enormous fortifications with countless artillery batteries. Now, they didn't really have enough men to man them properly, but it was the intelligence of the strength of the Mobile's defenses. They decided to bypass it, but I think Canby would have figured that out himself. But Sherman took a keen interest in Mobile as well, and he was writing to Canby in the months leading up to the Mobile campaign, and Henry Halleck, and recommending taking the eastern shore route as a path of least resistance. So that's what Canby did.
So Canby gets a little assist from the Navy because they take him part way up and drop him off, but they're not necessarily a factor through his advance. Maybe you can kind of kick off the march for us.
Okay, so on March 17th, the campaign begins. Granger's Corps marches down the Fort Morgan Peninsula and moves up towards present-day Fairhope, where the Fish River is. They're marching. The Navy transports A.J. Smith's guerrillas, the 16th Army Corps, across Mobile Bay, into Weeks Bay, and up the Fish River, and they set up an encampment at a place called Danley's Mill. Now, they brought in these shallow draft river monitors that were used during the Red River campaign, a lot of them, for operating on shallow rivers, because Mobile Bay is pretty shallow. So they brought them in, once the 13th and 16th Army Corps rendezvoused at Danley's Mill, they moved out the next day. And what happened was, as they're marching north, the gunboats were just in advance of the advanced columns of infantry, and they're shelling the shore of the eastern shore up to just south of the place we stopped at, that Bayfront Park on our tour. But they, at that point, they're going to run into the Blakely River bar, and they really struggled to get their shallow draft monitors over that river bar. And then they start running into some other things that von Schele had in store for them: obstructions, and more importantly, torpedoes, or water mines as we would know them today. And you know, they had some corroded torpedoes during the Battle of Mobile. One went off and caused the Tecumseh to sink, and loss of over 90 lives. But during the Mobile campaign, and even after the city fell, I think something like 12 vessels went down. I've seen the count at 10 and 12. Dabney Maury says 12. But during the actual Mobile campaign, I think it was something like 8 went down. And there were some others that had gone down earlier, the Narcissus and the Tecumseh. So the Navy paid a heavy toll. And after, even though they took precautions with the rigging, the net riggings and spars at the bow and stern of the boats to keep the torpedoes away, they would drag these areas before they would advance. But my understanding is the Confederates at Spanish Fort would just float down new barrels at night, and then they would have a tremendous impact on the U.S. Navy. So the Confederate ingenuity and obstructions, and specifically the torpedoes, had a devastating effect on the U.S. Navy, and so much so that the Navy was never able to achieve its objective of getting access to the Blakely River in the rear of Spanish Fort. And because of that, most of the garrison of Spanish Fort is going to escape, much to the chagrin of Canby's forces, who had been besieging Spanish Fort for 2 weeks.
Yeah. So as Canby begins his march in the middle of March, it takes him a while to get up to Spanish Fort, though.
Yeah. So
tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so he's marching up. They leave on St. Patty's Day, March 17th, 1865, and they don't arrive near Spanish Fort until the 26th of March. It's about a 30-mile, give or take, march. And, Smith's Corps didn't have to do the full amount because they had a little boat ride to cut a little bit of that off. But it's 30-plus miles, but it shouldn't have taken that long. Part of that's due to Canby's overly cautious MO. But the other part is they're having a lot of environmental issues. It's raining a lot. If you're familiar with Mobile, it rains a lot here. I think it's between us and Seattle with the largest rainfall. But basically what's happening is the dirt roads in Baldwin County, you've got over 26,000 troops marching. And, the early regiments get by through the swamp okay, but, as troops and wagons that are heavily loaded are going through the muddy water, it's becoming more and more difficult to traverse those roads. The roads get in really bad shape. So what they do is they start corduroying the road, and they corduroy a large percentage of those roads. And basically, for those who are not familiar with that, they would chop large pine trees down, split the trees in half so that you have the flat side up, and they would put them end to end perpendicular to the road to get over the real muddy parts of the road. So they're having a heck of a time dealing with that. And the first few days of the march, they don't really see much Confederate resistance. It's the roads and the environmental obstructions that are interfering in the weather and that sort of thing. And then as they get closer to Spanish Fort, then they're going to start running into about 500 cavalry scouts under a guy named Philip Brent Spence, and he is commanding the 16th Confederate Cavalry. That was a part of Armistead's brigade, not the Armistead Gettysburg fame. This is a different Armistead, and basically they took out the Mississippi. I'm sorry, they took out the uh, well, at this point they took out the Mississippi. No, they took out the Alabama regiments out of that Confederate cavalry, so they become the 12th Mississippi just before the campaign. So they were part of the 16th Confederate Cavalry, but then they redesignated the 12th just before the campaign. So these are Mississippi troopers that are opposing them. And basically, and they had about maybe 15 to 20 scouts and troopers from the 15th Confederate Cavalry, which was a locally raised cavalry outfit from the Mobile Bay area, Panhandle, Florida area. And they sent over 15 to 20 guys that were from Baldwin County that really knew the land. And they served as guides and scouts for the Mississippi horsemen. And basically what they would do is look for advantageous positions to pour fire into the advancing columns. And as the Federals are marching through this vast pine forest that was also a turpentine plantation. And as people know that turpentine is highly flammable. So what they would do is, as they were falling back, they would torch the place. So they had these big fires, and they would get on just north of the fire where they can see the Federals marching through the fire, and then they would pour in fire. So they caused the Canby's forces, 500 men, really held up 26,000 plus Federals as they advanced to Spanish Fort. So they did a lot with a little.
So, yeah, and I don't think people realize, like, Campy's got 26,000 guys. That's not a small force.
Yeah, and he's actually going to get over 13,000 more from Steele's column that's marching out of Pensacola, Brancas. They marched from Brancas to Pensacola up to Pollard, cut the rail line at Pollard, and then he's going to move over. Plus Lucas's cavalry division, and they're going to move once they cut the rail line at just north of the state line in Florida at Pollard. They're going to move east and attack Blakely. So combined, Canby's got over, I believe it's around 40 in round numbers, 45,400 troops, and that's not including the Navy. The Navy has 38 armed vessels, including 6 ironclads. So this is a tremendous allocation of resources by the federal government to capture Mobile. And I always say that, if Mobile wasn't important. Well, that's a hindsighted comment. If it was Grant as general in chief who ordered the attack of Mobile, it was his decision, not Farragut, not Admiral Thatcher, not Canby. It was Grant's decision to move against Mobile. He thought Mobile was important, and he allocated a considerable assets to take Mobile. I mean, 45,000 plus troops and
At this point, I mean,
a large naval fleet.
I mean, the manufacturing capabilities of Selma are extremely important to the Confederacy. And so, capturing those, which as you pointed out earlier, that's kind of the main objective here. You got to get past Mobile because you can't have an enemy force in your rear if you're going further north. And so obviously you got to kind of hit those dominoes in order, right?
You could, technically, I guess you could have bypassed Mobile altogether and marched into the interior from Barrancas. But now you have an awfully long communication line that's going to be subject to the attack of over 9,000 Confederates who know the land a lot better than you do. And that was problematic. So that's part of the reason why Mobile was an important place to capture, because they wanted Mobile's logistic capacity to aid their further expeditions into the interior of Alabama.
And Canby's worried about his supply line even as he's moving up towards Spanish Fort at this point too, right?
Right. And at that, once they start besieging Spanish Fort, the roads that they had traveled upon were destroyed. They don't, and it's a long hike back down to Fort Morgan to get the heavy artillery pieces. So Joseph Bailey of Red River campaign fame builds a wharf with his black engineering brigade. I think the 97th regiment's there. I believe it's the 96th or 95th. I think my memory's getting bad. It's in my book. My book knows.
Yeah.
But definitely the 97th USCT is there. And in a very short period of time, Joseph Bailey was a very autocratic leader, and he is slapping faces and cussing people and everything else to build this tremendous wharf that the Federals are able to use to bring in supplies, heavy artillery, take out the wounded, and bring in whatever they need to besiege Spanish Fort. And that's going to be set up. It would have been known as the Village in 1865, but today it would be known as Daphne, Alabama.
So when does Canby finally get to Spanish Fort? What does he see? What do the Confederates have waiting for him?
So he gets to Spanish Fort, and this is the thing I like to, I've read countless diary accounts from these Federal soldiers, both enlisted and officers, and they don't think they're going to see any resistance at all. In fact, when they're encamped at Fort Morgan and Fort Gaines, there's rumors going around the camp that Mobile's already evacuated. In fact, they sent a naval force reconnaissance to test the batteries along the shores of south of Mobile to see if they would get any kind of response, and they got a response. But they had thought Mobile had evacuated. Canby always believed Mobile was going to evacuate. What the Confederates weren't going to think it was worth defending, but they did. They did believe it was worth defending, and so they're operating under this false impression that Mobile is, as soon as they show up, man, these Confederates are going to hightail it out of here. That's not what happened at all, especially at Spanish Fort. Randall E. Gibson, 33-year-old Army of Tennessee veteran, had fought at Shiloh and all the Chickamauga and throughout the Atlanta campaign. He is in charge of Spanish Fort. And he was a proponent, he was a very close friend and defender of John Bell Hood. And he favored Hood's aggressive tactics. And when he takes command of Spanish Fort, he is not sitting on his heels and just being purely defensive. He is attacking. He's sending out large sorties every day for the first week, multiple times in some instances, and some of them quite successful. The morning of the first day of the investment, he sends out 550 Louisianans and attacked the 13th Army Corps, and he was doing that to keep them off balance, and he was very aggressive. And if you look at some of the letters that these Federal officers are sending back to their family members, they can't believe the resistance they get. I mean, guys, you got to remember the context here. This is after Franklin and Nashville. People think that there's no fight left. The Army is ruined, and these guys couldn't possibly have anything left in them. Not after Nashville. Well, they did.
Yeah. And they've got an incredibly strong topographical position. The fort that they stake out is on top of a pretty dominant hill with pretty steep sides.
Yeah, it's unique for Alabama because it's pretty flat in Alabama. But yeah, it's on a bluff, and basically the Spanish Fort. The reason why they call it Spanish Fort, they don't know this 100%, but it was a colonial era, revolutionary era fort there that they believe was the Spanish that garrisoned it, and basically the Confederates improved that existing earthen fortification, strengthened it, and then they put 4 more redoubts around it, and that became the Confederate Spanish Fort. But it was basically added on and expanded on the Revolutionary period Spanish Fort.
So the siege of Spanish Fort goes on for 2 weeks. What goes on during those 2 weeks? Is it just kind of staring at each other, or as your book suggests, maybe there's stuff going on?
No,
As your book,
there
as your
was,
book title suggests.
yeah, it was digging all night and fighting all day. That was you know, Ted Savis. You know, I'm not very creative. That's why I can't write I can't write fiction. I like nonfiction. I like facts. I like looking at that sort of thing. But I was just going to call it the Siege of Spanish Fort, and 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 Ted was like, no, that's not good. That's not good enough. And I couldn't, I'm not creative. So I conferred with a guy, a technical guy, expert who recently passed away, ran a museum up at Marbury with the Alabama Historical Commission, a guy named Bill Rambo. And he was very helpful to me in making sure I had all the facts right and just, double checking my research and that sort of thing. But I said, Bill, my publisher he's not happy with this. He wants more, and I'm like, I don't know what to do. I'm not creative. And he suggested to me, why not call it digging all night and fighting all day? And that's where the title comes from. But that's really, if you wanted to sum up Spanish Fort, that does it. Both sides were digging all night and fighting all day. They didn't have much time to rest. It was perpetual fighting. I don't know how they did it. I mean, just these guys were tough as nails. They were fighting all day and night. And each night, the Federals were digging closer and closer, these zigzag approaches, and they're moving their advanced lines closer and closer to the main works of Spanish Fort. In some places, they're within, yards of the main lines of Spanish Fort, so close that they could have conversations
Wow.
in these advanced rifle pits. The Minnesota pioneers constructed these gum tree mortars that they had used at Spanish Fort and other places. I'm sorry, they had used at Vicksburg and other places. And these were, fairly lightweight wooden mortars, cohorn mortars, and they would carry them into the advanced rifle pits and lob shells into Confederate Spanish Fort. And the Confederates also used a version of this, but so they would do that, and they would throw hand grenades. They also, use these. They called them I hope I'm not mispronouncing this. Matlets or matlegs. Basically, these were steel shields. I would describe it kind of like a sheet of metal, a sheet of steel, and they would cover up the cannon uh, embrasures, and they would lift that. They stick the cannon out real quick and fire, but they use these there, so they like that. And then Beauregard had designed it was like a rifle slit. I forget what he called. I describe it in the book, but basically it was a wooden embrasure that the sandbags went around. That the guy, instead of using headlogs, and they use those quite a bit. But they're using hand grenades. They're using landmines. They're using Calhoun mortars. They have heavy artillery, light artillery. Everything you can think of is being employed during the siege of Spanish Fort, and it really resembles, if you compare it to earlier battles of the Civil War, it's much. You can see how the evolution of warfare has kind of, by 1865 in Spanish Fort, it looks a lot closer to World War One trench warfare than it does, let's say Manassas. So from a military historian standpoint, you can see the evolution of military tactics by the time you get to Spanish Fort.
After all this effort by Canby, getting up the east side of the bay, investing the fort, Confederates escape.
Yeah, can you imagine if you'd been, now the Union soldiers were happy as could be at first because, yeah, we got the fort, we captured it, we got all this artillery, and the 16th Corps and the 13th Corps are pissed off at each other because they're arguing who got in there first. It was the 16th Corps, but they're arguing over who captured what and this and that, but Canby's pissed, and I mean they're trying to end this war, and these guys just got away, and they're just going to have, in their minds, they're going to have to face them again. So they escape on a treadway. It's one of the most remarkable escapes of the Civil War. If Spanish Fort had occurred in 62 or 63, I think it would have been far more well known. Maybe my book will help correct that, but had it happened earlier, this escape that over 2,000 troops under the cover of darkness took their shoes off to not make much noise, and they basically filed out of the rear of Spanish Fort on a narrow wooden treadway pier that went to the Blakely River, and there they jumped off, and there were every type of boat you can think of to get them out were there to pick them up, and some of the guys there weren't enough boats, and they didn't want the sun to come out the next morning. They're still kind of exposed, so they had another route through the swamp that went all the way up into the rear of Blakely. So they escaped, and they were temporarily dropped off at Fort Blakely, which is 4 miles to the north of Spanish Fort, and they think they're going to be in for it again. But General Maury decides to bring all of Spanish Fort's garrison to Mobile, and leaves Fort Blakely to their fate.
And then Fort Blakely ends up falling as Wilmer McLean is hosting Lee and Grant in his parlor. Is this massive assault against Fort Blakely? So I mean, the war's still going on, even though people are kind of thinking about the surrender of the war, right?
Yeah, even after, yeah, I mean, look, there's no question about it. The Army of Northern Virginia was the principal army of the Confederacy, and when Lee surrendered, people knew what that meant. But it was not a foregone conclusion that Richard Taylor's department, that Kirby Smith's department, Johnston's still at large. They don't know if these guys are going to fight a guerrilla war. Could you imagine with Forrest cavalry and the remnants of the Mobile garrison in Alabama, which is, even to this day is largely a big forest? Could you imagine the how complicated things would get if a guerrilla war had ensued? And they considered that. But luckily, and I'm very thankful that we live in a country that could go through something as terrible as the Civil War and come out of it. And we had leaders like Richard Taylor, Canby, Lee, Grant, Sherman, Johnston, that realized the gig was up, the war was over, and it was time to move on and become brothers again and countrymen again. And I'm very thankful for that, because that's not how things played out in a lot of places, most places. It was very unusual how the Civil War ended. But I'm thankful, even though there's still some animosity between the sections a little bit, not as much as it used to be. I'm very thankful that we had guys that took a conciliatory approach. And Richard Taylor, who was in charge of the Department of East Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama at the time, the son of Zachary Taylor, Mobile was under his command, showed a lot of character, and I think he deserves a lot of respect for how he conducted the ceasefire and aided in the transition into peacetime.
So when does Mobile itself then actually fall, as kind of dominoes all over the Confederacy are falling at this point once things get going with Lee and Grant, but they still don't realize the war's over
yet.
Yeah.
Okay, so April 9th, Fort Blakely's assaulted about 3 hours after Lee had surrendered, give or take. Okay, it's captured, but there's still the next morning in Mobile, April 10th, they ring the church bells signaling an evacuation of the Confederates from Mobile. That's April 10th. There's 2 batteries in the marsh that had been there from the beginning of the war, batteries Hugie and Tracy.
and they're manned by the 22nd Louisiana and the 1st Mississippi artillery units. And they're still there, and they're ordered. They had been holding their fire through for the previous week because they didn't have a lot of ammunition. Now they're ordered to open all guns and hold out as long as they can, or fire at will. And they're firing against both the U.S. Navy that's inching its way up towards Spanish Fort still, and federally occupied Spanish Fort. And so they're basically covering the evacuation of Mobile. So for 2 days, those batteries held out, and there was a fierce cannonading duel between the Federals at Spanish Fort and those two Confederate marsh batteries. And then on the evening of April 11th, a courier comes to them and says, "Hey, it's time to go. You guys have done well. It's time to evacuate." They evacuate. They get everybody out, and the 22nd Louisiana is among the last troops to leave Mobile by boat on the Mobile River, which basically becomes the Alabama River. So on the morning of April 12th, the last rear guard cavalry leaves Mobile, April 12th, 1865.
Wow. So I mean, it takes a while, and then when Canby actually goes in, he just sails across the bay. He doesn't even go through the
Yeah, he
mud.
doesn't even go the route that he was going to. And it was funny is General Comstock, who was one of Grant's trusted aides. Grant was becoming, as we talked about earlier, was becoming very impatient with the slow pace of the expedition. So he sends General Comstock, down to find out what's going on and to push the expedition along, get the show on the road. And Comstock's like, "We just need to go. There's no one over there. We need to go across the bay. We don't need to waste our time here." And he was right. But finally, they agree, and they go over, and as they're coming across, this is 13th Corps, Gordon Granger's 13th Corps is coming across Mobile Bay. They're going to land just south of the city of Mobile, and they're expecting the officers of the regimental commanders are expecting like a Normandy Day beach invasion or something. We got to get ready, guys. As soon as we get out, we got to charge the shores. They're going to land and all this, and they have these German officers, and you see in the diary accounts the soldiers are kind of making fun of the accents of their German commanders that are all animated. They're trying to get these guys ready for this beach landing invasion of Mobile. And as they got close to the shore, one of the gunboats, I think it was the Metacomet, launches a shell towards the battery, the shore batteries of south of Mobile, and gets no response. But there's an old, feeble black gentleman with a handkerchief, waving, "Don't shoot, don't shoot," with his white handkerchief. That's the only thing there was no resistance. So they landed there, and soon the mayor and some of the city councilmen came down on a horse and carriage. They didn't have a white flag, but they put a big white bed sheet on the back of their carriage as they went down to surrender to the representatives of the Navy and the Army.
Wow. So if someone goes to Spanish Fort today, what can they see?
Well, first you got Fort McDermott, which was the strongest position of the Confederate defenses. And that's owned by the local Admiral Sims SEV Camp 11. So they own that. It's a private park, but it's open to the public. And they're very proud of that park, and they maintain it. You were there yourself. You saw what they're doing there. So you can go and see that, and it's pretty awesome, I think. So you can see that. You can also, as you drive through the neighborhood, there's numerous historical signage throughout the neighborhood that you can see. Some of it's less than accurate, but most of it's pretty accurate. But a lot of the key positions, like Old Spanish Fort, the Red Fort, Battery Blair, where the 5th Company in Washington Artillery was, these are in people's backyards or on private property. Now, one of the places we went and I got lost on the way out was the green space in the northern flank of Spanish Fort. This is where the assault took place. Well, this is owned by the city of Spanish Fort, and it's a green space. And if you know what you're looking for, you can still discern the artillery positions, gun rifle pits, and you were there. What'd you think?
Yeah, I mean, some impressive work still stretched through there, and then some traverses and that perpendicular trench, and I mean, you can really see that landscape there, as forested as it is. I mean, you can kind of see where that action took place.
You got to be careful there. I've been there many times, and I think if I do another tour, I'm going to have to get some orange tape to mark a couple spots, especially on the way out. We don't end up in someone's backyard.
But yeah, but it is worth going through the neighborhood and looking at the signs, because if all you do is look at Fort McDermott, which is extremely well preserved, they're doing a really nice job of that park, but you don't get a sense of just how big the fort was unless you drive through that neighborhood and see the signs, and it's like, oh, this is a couple
Yeah,
miles worth of stuff.
yeah, and again, there's one street that in the front yard is the Confederate rifle pits. It would be opposite. It would be just south of where we went through the woods, and you can just drive down the street and you can just see all the rifle pits and the breastworks in people's front yards. Are all connected, and people have little boardwalks that go across over on top of them, and some jerks bulldozed them down because they want a flat green front yard, but for the most part, they're there. It's really kind of cool to see that where the so-called sandbag battery was at, and but you can go through it, and like I said, if anybody's ever coming through, just look me up. If I'm not doing anything, I'll be glad to take you through and show you some things, and there's a lot of other places too. There was an Indiana, it was Union Battery number 22 that was manned by the 1st Indiana Heavy Artillery on Minette Bay, that was erected to combat those marsh batteries that we talked about a little while ago. But that's there, and that's overlooking the bay. It's a beautiful site, and it's on an easement there as well. But we didn't get a chance to go there. I really wanted to take you guys there, but yeah, there was some logistical issues.
Yeah. And let's give a quick shout out to Mike Bunn and his staff up at Fort Blakely, Blakely State Historical Park, which preserves that part of the story, and a fantastic site to visit as
No,
well.
they do it. If you get a chance to come to Mobile, you got to go to Blakely. I mean, it was the largest land battle in Alabama. It was the last major battle of the war. It has some of the most well preserved earthen fortifications for both Union and Confederate, probably in the country. Yeah, I mean, you've been to a lot more places. I'm kind of hyper focused on the Mobile Bay area, but I know you've been to just about everywhere. What do you think of the earthworks at Fort Blakely and Spanish Fort compared to some other places?
Yeah, I think, particularly Blakely, they're so well preserved. And they've recreated a lot of what the landscape looked like, so you can kind of see the assault field, and so it's a pretty incredible set of fortifications, well worth visiting. And I think that
Yeah.
the work that SCV did at Fort McDermott, so you can really kind of see how impressive those works are. They've done a
Used
nice
to be,
job
I
there.
remember when before they kind of cleared the underbrush, you couldn't discern hardly anything.
Yeah.
It was just looked like kind of a thickly wooded lot. But there's some people here that are passionate about, and I'm trying to connect them with the Battlefield Trust people to, join forces on some things. But the Blakely staff, Mike Bunn, and there's a guy named Brian Desroche, who's a real big reenactor. If you see this guy, you'll be like, holy crap, this guy literally just left the battlefield of Chickamauga. I mean, he looks the part, man, and he's not one of these reenactors that wear tennis shoes. I'm not a reenactor, but every now and then I'll go out there when they're having an event, and I'll serve as kind of like a guides and showed the public during the reenactment. I'm telling them what's going on and that sort of thing. But they'll give me some period uniform to wear, uniform outfit to wear, and they give me these really, really uncomfortable shoes, and I just couldn't. It didn't fit. It hurt. And Brian, man, he would not relent. You're wearing those. My feet are killing me, But I mean, there's no coolers, there's no beer cans. They are doing their best to truly reenact the circumstance. I don't think you can ever totally. We can't even come close to reenacting what really happened, but they're going to get about as close as they're going to kind of really try to live it. He's an interesting, but that kind of dedication and passion you can see when you go to the park, and it's cool to see because I'm not a reenactor. I know a lot of them, but it's kind of cool to see what a guy who's real passionate about this subject, and he gets to go to work every day at a really cool battlefield and make a difference and make contributions, and Mike Bunn, and they're just wonderful people over there, and what they've done is incredible. My Civil War roundtable in Mobile, we do what we can to support their endeavors there.
Yeah, great stuff. The book is Digging All Night and Fighting All Day, the Civil War Siege of Spanish Fort and the Mobile Campaign. It's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. Paul, thanks so much for taking some time to talk with us today.
Always a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Likewise, my friend. I'm Chris Mikowski for the Emerging Civil War Podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.